So I think we have time for some questions. If our speakers want to come up, and I assume you two want to come up as well, and you can, Melanie can go up. Okay, that's fair enough. So here's share microphones.
So thank you. Great, interesting to listen to. So I have a general question for all of you and actually a specific question for each of you. So the general question is going to be easier, I think, for the second two presentations. So Kristin, it might be harder for you, but if it is, I have a way to come into it. And the general question has to do with the role of the screen in digital rhetoric, because it seems to me that in some ways that's a through line. And Kristin, I wanted you to talk a little bit, if you might. In one of your slides, you had an image of rocks on a river. And I wondered if you could talk about how intentional or not, if you can remember the slide, that particular slide was. For the second presentation, I was interested in how the kids reacted to the kids' civil rights project, because you talked a lot about the other part of it, but not, in fact, what the impact of that was on them. And on the last one, one of your slides had make cheese, not war, which I think of as connected to Vietnam, because that's the trope there, if my memory serves correctly. And I'm wondering if you might talk about that in terms of Occupy Wall Street. Thanks.
I'll answer both of your questions. You know, I want to trouble the relationship between digital rhetoric and the screen, because I think whether it's communication studies or English or cinema studies or media studies, there's a preoccupation with the screen as the motor of meaning construction. And as a practitioner, what I learned is that most of the forms of agitation with actual digital media happened way before the screen. The screen is an important part of it, but if we, and I wouldn't have known that if I wasn't a practitioner, if I was just, and that's how I was for most of my scholarly life, is just looking at things on the screen because that's what I could get a hold of. But by becoming a practitioner, I realized there were so many other parts. And so I hope to continue troubling digital rhetoric's relationship to the screen. In terms of and I apologize for not getting to kind of explore the civil rights, the Rural Civil Rights Project, the kids. That was a very profound experience for me and them that I'm still kind of unpacking. But the agency, the kids went from being very overly disciplined, highly policed, to be given the space to actually explore ideas and articulate their identity. And I would think that that was a really intense experience that I might kind of rethink again, given that I didn't know how big the space was between their schooling experience and how they're supposed to understand themselves as intellectuals and what I was asking them to do. At one point, I allowed multiple groups to be doing different things at one time, and that like made the principal's head spin. That I would say, you as a student get to decide what's more important to you right now. Like, because I was teaching them how to drop beats on GarageBand, I was teaching them how to do oral history on, and do work. I was teaching them to, kind of take, we were doing self-portraits at one point. They were like thinking about, they had some really interesting insights on Andy Warhol. But, yeah, so I would say that, it was a big space to overcome, one that I would probably correct a bit, but that also made me very alarmed about K through 12 education.
So I can talk a little bit about screens and maybe the role that they play in our project. This was actually one of our first entrances into starting to study Occupy photography in the context of larger protest movements. We were really struck by the presence of screens in photographs. So it seemed like the practices that are emerging on the ground are encouraging people to think of protest photography not as a documentary practice that gives evidence after the fact of what people are engaging in when they do protest, but instead it becomes the form of protest itself. intimately involves screens. It becomes people's entrance into participating in Occupy protests. And it becomes an important symbol of the images that circulate. So it comes to stand in for the practices of critical spectatorship that we want to suggest start to blur those boundaries between the actor and the spectator in public spaces and in public movements. So screens for us signal the new possibilities that digital production and digital circulation make possible for contemporary protesters. And then I don't know if you wanted to talk about this sign in particular.
So one of the things that we're tracing are these forms of citation and circulation. So it's for us, I mean, for it to show up as a protest, you have to remediate all these kind of tropes or tactics of old protest cultures. So even in Occupy Wall Street, there's all these kind of old analog technologies of protest that protesters are remediating, and protest signs and specific slogans themselves are one of those forms of remediation. What's interesting, however, is the way that the public discourse about protest imagines Occupy as this kind of starting point. So it's a question of how is this discourse about social media, about social digital protest, digital technologies and protest, reshaping our memory of dissent and resistance as a kind of modal point of democratic citizenship.
And I think I can actually answer the screen thing in sort of relation to what both these folks are saying is, I think there's a preoccupation with a lot of people who do digital production to get fixated on the screen as like a fixed moment within that act of production. And so for me, Indigenous philosophies gives me a way of thinking, yeah, there is that kind of moment of the screen, but being fascinated solely with the screen, we lose a lot. We lose a lot that goes into those acts of digital production. Not to say the screen's not important, but a fetishization of it can be problematic. And the stones were purposeful. Only step into the same river once, right? Because it keeps moving. And so the moment you step into it, you have that moment, and then the moment's gone.
Okay, so I appreciated the invitation to take seriously ways of knowing that are not typical within the academy, and then also ways of making and practicing those things. And what advice for how to do those things without looking like the tourists taking pictures of the people who are actually, that's their ways of knowing, and that those are their ways of making.
I think you have to share interests with the people you're recording. I think you have to share a motivation. I think that the act of presenting oneself as a tourist is a separation from what's happening. And so I think the thing that's really interesting about the photography that you're dealing with, and I would actually also encourage you to trace back to the kind of the tropes of violence that get started around the anti-globalization movements, and this is what democracy looks like, and other forms, because I think those tropes are showing up in your work, is that this kind of photography, these kind of images happening from the inside. And I think that's it. You have to be on the inside.
Yeah, to echo that, the image of the protesters are inviting the tourist into this conversation, but they're sort of, like they're standing on the signs themselves and not actually willing to engage in that conversation.
Hello, that is that's your reading of the image. Now one could say the opposite, which is the wake up is not towards the tourist. Now if you're pro-Occupy, you're not gonna like this reading, but towards the protesters, because you didn't do anything or change anything other than camp out in a park. So you could say the protester needs to wake up and understand your delivery isn't working. If you go around today and say to people, so it's like that Edward Snowden and John Oliver thing, did you watch that? So Oliver, they go around, he's interviewing Snowden, and he shows them a series of interviews where they go around the street saying, who's Edward Snowden? People go, I don't know.
Right.
Go around and ask people, what was Occupy about? I don't know.
Right.
So you could also call it a failed moment, Occupy, and that the wake up is the protesters whose Adbuster-based delivery system, which was just based on Adbusters, didn't work. The other reading is too easy to go after the tourist. That's low hanging fruit. You understand?
Right. And so, yeah, this is a really important question because the argument that Occupy was an example of a failed protest is something else that we're responding to in this larger project. And I think this is a question of how do you determine whether or not a movement is successful or not. Typically, we assume that movements have to produce some sort of institutional systemic change in order for it to produce some sort of effect in the world. But as critics who are communication critics, we also look at how the structure of language begins to transform, how Occupy becomes something that we talk about to begin with is one indices of how we might talk about the success of a particular movement. So, you know, we try to say, our argument is that Occupy as forms of speaking citizenship may have been a failure if we look at it that way. But if we look at Occupy as this movement that's encouraging us to think about spectatorship as visual citizens, it's actually producing effects in the world. Though I think that there's an important tension there, and that is, you know, like ultimately, what are we trying to look at when we talk about success or failure?
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question about agency and intention. Because Angela, you made a very clear statement about rhetorical agency. And Emily, you did something really interesting towards the end when you talked about the active spectator and you didn't want to invert the relationship of agency and rhetoric. But I didn't understand that as much. That wasn't as clear to me as what Angela was saying. So could you talk about the difference between the two of you, whether you want to maintain a difference or reconcile the two claims about agency?
Well, in terms of thinking of resisting the impulse to just reverse the valuation of the spectator over the actor, what we're really trying to do is to think outside of a model where the spectator and the actor are separate, discrete individuals, and think instead about how a single figure can move through these different perspectives. And that, in fact, is what we're reading the photographs as invitations to do, to imagine yourself as acting as you're watching, and also to imagine that there are forms of action that can only happen in relation to other people through visual practices in public spaces. So it's a I guess we would probably move away from the idea of intention, but there's still an agency in the critique and the judgment that is invoked in those moments of visual public address and public engagement. And that's where we see the real empowerment of the spectator coming forward in these practices.